So first of all, thank you to everybody for joining the webinar tonight. It's much appreciated to have your attendance. We are going to be discussing the subject of Lynx. Our first speaker for the evening is David Bavin, who is the Senior Carnivore Project Officer with the Vincent Wildlife Trust, who are looking at doing a report at the moment into the feasibility of the reintroduction of Lynx. So I won't spoil any of what he's going to tell you, and I will just hand over to him to start us off for the evening.
All right, thanks, Jem, and thanks you all for having me here. Let me just share this. I'm going to more or less get straight into it because I want to make sure I get through this so there's plenty of time for us to discuss things. I probably won't take any questions while I'm doing this so that I can keep to time and get through it. But if you type anything to the chat, then it will get through, or you can hold on to it. But as Jen says, we are currently working on a study called the NSA Scotland study, with the aim of exploring how people feel about the potential to have lynx back in Scotland. So we are the Vincent Wildlife Trust. So that's me and my colleague Jenny McPherson on this call. And so we're quite a small NGO. We focus mainly on mammal conservation in the UK and Europe. We've got a reputation for working on bats and carnivores, and most recently we conducted a pine marten reintroduction to Wales. And we're quite innovative. We try and lead on developing solutions to problems, and we undertake research and try and apply these findings to the real world. And we like to work across the sectors. So, when we were doing the pine marten work, this is us down in Wales doing, working with some of the local farmers to help out with the lambing, and taking out a group of gamekeepers to radio track the pine martens. So we like to work across the sectors to try and get everyone involved in what we're up to. So we've been contracted by Scotland the Big Picture and Trees for Life to conduct this study of what people feel about the prospect of lynx reintroduction. So we were asked to do this, or we accepted the offer to do this because we felt like we could deliver this objectively and professionally based on our experience in carnivore work and in reintroductions. And we felt it was a time to do it because there's been a lot of stuff flying around about lynx. It's a conversation which is going on, and to date it's probably not been approached in the right way, arguably. So this is not attached to a reintroduction proposal, and a reintroduction proposal is not in the pipeline. This is kind of an exploratory bit of work, and we have absolutely no connection with the Lynx UK Trust. We're not affiliated with them. We don't have any contact with them, and we don't particularly agree with what they're up to. So basically our remit is to objectively explore the views of stakeholders in the Cairngorms National Park and Argyll towards the potential for lynx reintroduction. So, can we be objective in this is a big question. Well, we have no vested interest in, we've not worked on a project like this in Scotland before. We've not worked on lynx before. We've never worked with Trees for Life or Scotland Big Picture before, so we're independent of them and their funders, and we will basically apply an approach which is scientifically grounded and will represent everyone's voice equally in this. So I think we can be as objective as anybody, and probably most appropriate given our expertise in this area. So the stakeholders in this, these are land users. So this is farming, field sports, conservationists, recreation and tourism, forestry, research, landowners and managers. These are the kind of stakeholders that we'll be doing the bulk of this exercise with. And engagement in this does not equal support or endorsement. So, people can engage in this and make their views known without it being a sign of endorsement or support. There'll be some level of community consultation, but this will be, quite low key. It's not going to be, we're not going to be doing a wide scale public opinion survey, kind of yes, no exercise towards lynx reintroduction, because those kind of surveys, they're not particularly relevant. You can end up with these kind of surveys which say 90% of the British public support lynx reintroduction, but they don't mean a great deal on the ground, and they can be and have been used before sort of quite unethically to leverage pressure on local communities. So that's not what we're going to do in this. We're going to repeat this first phase of work, which we're currently conducting in the Cairngorms down in Argyll in the autumn and the winter. And the objective is to report back to Trees for Life and Scotland Big Picture by the end of February. And that report will basically make a recommendation of whether it's appropriate or not to carry on pursuing the objective of lynx reintroduction. So now I'm going to introduce the lynx really briefly to you for those who aren't familiar, but it's one of 4 species of lynx around the world. So we have the bobcat, the Canadian lynx, the Iberian, and the Eurasian lynx. Now the Eurasian lynx is the largest of the bunch. It's often described as a little big cat. So the average male would be about 23 kilos, and average female about 18 kilograms. And I know it's not a great picture on the top right, but you can kind of get a rough idea of how you know their size in relation to a person. Now they're an ambush predator, so they're not built to chase or like a wolf or anything like that. They're very much about hiding in cover and ambushing their prey. So their favoured habitat is woodland, and they're generally associated with woodland and restricted to woodland throughout their range. But they can use more open landscapes in places which have fragmented woodlands, such as the Jura. So historically, they used to be over most of Europe, with the exception of the south. Obviously their range has declined until and we get to a stage in the 1960s when they're left in the sort of Carpathians in Romania and then around Scandinavia. Currently, their stronghold is still in Scandinavia and the Baltic, with healthy populations in Romania and the Carpathians. They've been reintroduced to a number of areas in Europe, and you can see that in the red. And it's currently estimated that there's about 10,000 lynx across their European range. And the most recent evidence of them in Scotland is about 400 years ago. So there's various bits of evidence throughout the British Isles that lynx were present. And I think some of the most recent evidence in Scotland was from the Grampian Mountains, which was about 400 years ago. So they have very large home ranges, lynx. So like most carnivores, the males have larger home ranges than the females, and their home range size is basically dependent on how much food is available to them. So the more food and the more productive the land, the more food, the smaller their home ranges. So in Scandinavia, they can be very large because it's less productive and there's less food. So you can have some territories which have been recorded as 1,400 square kilometers, which is enormous. But Switzerland and Poland, that's probably slightly more, I won't say normal, but what we would expect of a mid-European lynx territory. So a typical density would range from half a lynx to 1.5 lynxes per 100 square kilometers, or 25,000 acres. So to put that into context, there's about 623 square kilometers of woodland in the Cairngorms National Park. So you might expect there to be approximately 6 territories in somewhere like the Cairngorms, just to give you an idea of how many lynx will fit into the landscape. So they're carnivores. So they've been recorded predating around 30 species of prey, but the vast majority of their diet is from hoofed animals. So this will be medium-sized hoofed animals such as roe deer and chamois. And in fact, roe deer are by far the most important prey across the whole of their range. Even when roe deer are quite scarce, lynx will select for roe deer. And if you look at the lynx's size and its body shape and its modus operandi, the way it hunts, then it's very much tailored to ambushing roe deer. In the northern part of their range, where lynx where it's less productive and there's less roe deer, then hare species, so mountain hare and brown hare and woodland grouse species become more important. But this, where deer are getting scarce, they across their range, they will also predate on fallow, sika, and red deer sometimes as well. Although red deer generally are at the upper limit of what they can take down. But you'll also see in that 10%, there's things like, small birds, marmots, wild boar, and domestic livestock, which we'll come on to. And foxes. So the carnivores, I've included this slide because this is one of the reasons why proponents of lynx would like to see them returned, and I'll come on to this. But top predators like the lynx, they can have an indirectly positive effect on the prey species of medium-sized predators like foxes. So it's thought that, for example, grouse species can benefit from the presence of lynx because lynx are known to kill foxes, pine martens, feral cats, wildcats, weasels, and badgers. This is particularly strong relationship between lynx and foxes. So this study in Europe, which is pretty comprehensive, found that lynx can basically suppress fox populations at a national and regional level, with the canny title of "Where Lynx Prevail, Foxes Fail." So there is, in places where there's low productivity and foxes are not particularly common, then lynx can have quite a strong effect in controlling and reducing their numbers. But this is not always the case. So in productive landscapes, there's no evidence of this relationship. So where you have a lot of arable production and there's high productivity, then that bottom-up productivity overrides any top-down effect of the top predator. And also in areas where you've got large human settlements and foxes can adapt and make a living off those edges, then you don't see this effect. So why is Scotland even being considered for this conversation? Well, initially it was researched by Dr. David Hetherington, who looked at the habitat network in northern Scotland, or identified a habitat network for about 15,000 square kilometres. And he surmised, based on the availability of habitat and the densities of deer, that there was a capacity for a population in Scotland of about 400 lynx, spread across these two areas you can see here, a highland population and one in the southern uplands. So he based this on data from 2002, which was revisited recently by Tom Ovenden at Bangor. And he used data from the Forest Inventory in 2015, and he also concluded that there was a viable network of habitat in the Highlands based on the availability of habitat and the number of deer that were available. So, this is one of the aspects that underpins people's aspirations for lynx reintroduction. So one of the key elements is there enough habitat? Well, it would seem like there is. It would need to be revisited, looked into in more detail, but at a course level, it would seem like there is habitat enough. So why even have this conversation? Lynx haven't been around for 400 years. Why do proponents of lynx want to reintroduce them to Scotland? Well, one, for nature conservation. So, for the sort of fundamental goal of restoring an absent member of the British fauna, based on their sort of last known presence in the Grampians of about 400 years ago. For proponents, it would be a response to global biodiversity decline. It would be sort of a positive action to try and ameliorate biodiversity loss, to restore ecosystem processes, specifically regulation of herbivores. So, and this is mainly in relation to woodland deer, to complement deer control, and to be part of a sort of sustainable woodland management and regeneration objective. So it varies in places, and there's different opinions as to the severity of it, but deer numbers and deer browsing does seem to be an issue in Scotland when it comes to the health of woodlands and the ability to regenerate woodlands. And so the idea is that lynx might have a positive role in being a constant presence, which can exert pressure on deer numbers and deer behaviour. And there's also, within the conservation community, there's a desire to find a more sustainable solution to predation issues with species like capercaillie. So they would have interest in introducing top-down pressure on the smaller predators like foxes and badgers and martins from a top predator like the lynx. So these would be the kind of key arguments put forward by proponents of lynx reintroduction. So obviously what I'm going to focus on now for the rest of this presentation is something specific to you guys, which is the interactions between lynx and livestock. Now, it's not an issue for cattle. So lynx do not predate cattle, and there's no instances that I know of where lynx have predated cattle. They're also not really thought of as a major predator of poultry. You know, there will be occasions where the odd free-range chicken will disappear, but they're generally not considered to be a problem for poultry farmers. The issues where they arise are associated with sheep and goats, but I think in Britain we don't really farm goats on a commercial scale, on a large commercial scale. So I'm going to focus on sheep farming and the interactions between lynx and sheep. So in a review of 11 European countries, lynx were found to kill about 0.01 or 0.5% of the whole European stock. So it's not thought to be a sort of national or European-wide issue. And predation of sheep ranges by country from a few tens of sheep to a few hundred, with Norway being the exception. So generally in Europe, they're considered less of a threat than bears and wolves, and they're not thought of as an issue in Eastern and Central Europe. This is mainly because these places, they've never lost the lynx, so they've always had adaptive shepherding to deal with lynx and to deal with other predators, which include mainly these big guard dogs. And I don't know if anyone's walked around Central Europe and those areas, but those guard dogs are formidable. So the evidence overall suggests that sheep predation occurs where sheep range freely in or adjacent to woodlands inhabited by lynx. And that's the photo down the bottom right of a bit of a very poorly fenced pasture in the middle of the Palatinate forest in Germany, and they had issues of sheep predation there because the lynx was able to sort of walk freely into this pasture, which was surrounded by woodland. And in a recent, Joss Milner recently did a report for the British Deer Society on lynx, and one of her conclusions was that in Britain, lynx would be unlikely to use close cropped open hill ground where sheep range, but it's not clear whether lynx would pose a risk to hill sheep grazing on heather moorland. And I think that's one of the big questions, is how lynx would behave in those kind of rough interforest habitats like heather moorland, where you've got gorse and juniper and rocks and cover. So what I'll do now is I'll kind of run through some of the different countries and touch on the conflicts as they are, if there are conflicts, and some of the solutions that they've developed to deal with these. So just for context, we'll start with Sweden. And so just for context, Scotland has about 6.73 million sheep as of last year, which are mainly distributed down in the southern uplands, and the highest density I think is actually up in Orkney. Sweden has about a tenth of that number. They have about 1,200 lynx in Sweden, which are distributed. You can see that in the grey. The lynxes are distributed quite widely across the whole of Sweden, with some big gaps up in the north and the south. But generally speaking, lynx are quite widespread across Sweden. And the way that sheep are kept in Sweden, they're generally kept in fenced paddocks. They don't have a sort of culture of, free unsupervised grazing. The sheep are generally kept fenced in. So the data that I've managed to get hold of from the Wildlife Damage Centre, it shows that approximately 150 to 200 sheep are killed per year by lynx. So lynx are the blue line there. I'll mispronounce this. So if there's any Swedish speakers in, I apologize. Lodjur. And then you can see also, and then you've got Bjorn, which are bear, Orn, which are eagle, and Vag, which is wolf. The populations of wolf and bear in Sweden are very small. So they're sort of only just colonizing Sweden. But lynx have been there for quite a long time. But yeah, approximately 150 to 200 sheep are killed per year. This is data I've got for 2019, which highlights that 89 sheep were killed in 2019, 11 goats, 1 deer, and 13 other. I don't know what the other are. It could be poultry. In this case, it could be, I'm not sure, but I'm not actually sure what other is. But 89 sheep were killed in 2019. So for Sweden, it's about 150 to 200 sheep killed per year. In the Jura Mountains, you have a reintroduced population there, which were reintroduced in the early 70s. And so the French and Swiss Jura, the Jura Mountains span France and Switzerland and make up almost 12,000 square kilometers, which is about 3 times the size, for example, of the Cairngorms National Park. So sheep are kept generally in pastures of about 1 to 100 hectares or 1 to 250 acres. And they tend to be surrounded by electric fencing, which is designed to stop the sheep leaving not to stop predators coming in. But again, they're not, they're grazed in the hills, but they tend to be restrained in their movements. So during the period of reintroduction and the lynx's establishment and expansion, there was quite an exhaustive census of lynx attacks on sheep for that 15-year period. So between 1984 and 1998, 1,752 sheep were killed, which was about 146 per year on average. So most of the attacks were between May and November, when sheep are permanently on pasture. So, in the winter, they'd be taken in and protected from the harshness of the mountain winter. An average of about 15% of the flocks were attacked per year. And overall, the losses amounted to about 0.26% of the total flock. So the guys that wrote the study concluded there was no general lynx livestock problem in spite of the absence of protective measures. They thought that many flocks were not affected, and among those suffering attacks, most were only sporadically attacked. However, the high concentration of lynx damage to certain flocks is a factor that has been underestimated and has not been appreciated. So these localized and year-to-year persistent hotspots, they represent the major lynx livestock problem. And what this highlights, and what has been apparent elsewhere, is that you would identify predictable hotspots where lynx and their interactions with sheep can be problematic, and this does tend to be down to the topography, the way that the forests sit in relation to sheep pasture. So it's not so much that you have problem lynxes, but you tend to have problem locations, so that even if you take out a lynx from that location, another lynx will come in and might operate in the same way. And I'll come on to some of the reasons why in a bit. And then in Switzerland, I got this data from Dave Hetherington as well. The average sort of level of sheep predation is about 72 sheep per year. You get this peak in the middle here, and around 99, about the turn of the millennium, you get this peak. And so that was caused by it's thought to be caused by two factors. One was a series of very severe winters, in tandem with quite high quotas for roe deer bags for those years. So what happened was you had quite a severe crash in roe deer numbers, and you had a consequent increase in the number of sheep attacks. As a result of that, a number of lynx were lethally controlled, and I suppose the more normal pattern of seasonality returned, and roe deer numbers built up again. And since then, the sort of average number of sheep that are killed per year in Switzerland has remained about 72. So Norway, there's substantially greater losses of sheep to lynx reported in Norway. So Norway has approximately 2.2 million sheep. So, they have more sheep than Switzerland and Sweden. Not as many as we do in the UK, but they have more, and it's a stronger part of their culture. They have a population of about 350 lynx in Norway, which is kept relatively stable. So in Norway, an average of about 16,000 sheep per year are reported predated by lynx. And so, we compare this to an average of about 200 per year in Sweden and less than 150 in France and Switzerland. So, substantially higher, a substantially greater number of sheep are reported predated in Norway. And it's an issue for farmers. So in Norway, in order to balance their objectives of large carnivore conservation and sheep farming, they created these carnivore management zones, which are designated to protect species like brown bear, lynx, wolf, and wolverine. So there is sheep farming still in these carnivore management zones, but the majority of sheep farming goes on outside of these areas. But for farmers that are living within these carnivore management zones, the presence of predators does impact their business and does impact their well-being. So, but why is there so much more predation of sheep in Norway? Why does this seem to be the case compared to Sweden, for example, and France and Switzerland? Well, for one, they do have the full set of top predators, lynx, wolverine, brown bear, wolf, golden eagle. But historically, these species have been absent. So at one point, they would have been eradicated from Norway. And so sheep farming has developed in that situation without having to accommodate these large predators. Then they've recovered, but agricultural practices are not necessarily adapted to accommodate these species. Unmanaged pastures still constitute an essential part of Norwegian sheep production. So, sheep will generally be kept in over the winter and fed on fodder that's gathered from these unmanaged pastures, these hay meadows. But then in the summer, they'll be sort of freely grazed out, which enables them to keep more sheep, obviously, than they could if they were kept in managed pastures. And so they're turned out to roam the forest and the mountains unsupervised during spring and summer. So there's no active shepherding, because obviously it's, how can you shepherd these huge dispersed flocks of sheep? So the shepherding really is limited to sort of daily or periodic searches for carcasses of sheep, and they don't employ guard dogs in Norway in the unmanaged pastures. So the sheep tend to go around in groups of 2s or 3s in dispersed flocks within the woodland, where they're very vulnerable to attack. So most of these predatory species will be operating in the woodland. It's not such an issue when the sheep actually go up onto the mountain pasture. The issues tend to be within the forest, where they are obviously interacting with lynx and wolf and brown bear and wolverine. But crucially for the lynx, it's sheep and roe deer, which are obviously the preferred prey of lynx, are feeding in the same habitat in that forest. So studies by the researchers at the Norwegian Institute for Natural History have found a number of things. So obviously this gets a lot of research focus in Norway, because this is a big issue. This is a very prominent political issue, is the coexistence of the agricultural community and predators. So this gets a lot of research effort. So most lynx in Norway will kill sheep at some point in their lives, though typically it tends to be a male thing, or males tend to kill more sheep than females. So where sheep predation occurs, it's generally where lynx come across sheep while looking for roe deer. So there's a lot of tracking data which suggests that lynx will avoid sheep or go quite far out their way to find roe deer, even though there are sheep near at hand. But sheep predation can occur and does occur when lynx are looking for roe deer or other prey species. When sheep densities are low, lynx prey almost exclusively on roe deer. And when there are over 4 roe deer per square kilometre, then sheep predation effectively ceases, regardless of how many sheep there are. So if there's plenty of roe deer, then lynx tend not to touch sheep. So there aren't decent estimates of roe deer densities in Scotland, and it's obviously going to be variable, compared to the west coast compared to the east, highlands compared to lowlands. But generally speaking, people think there's between 8 and 25 roe deer per square kilometre, just for comparison, and to put that into context. So in Norway, particularly northern Norway, there's quite low densities of roe deer, because it's fairly, it's northern and mountainous and not particularly productive. So the general recommendation that these researchers make is to retain more of the sheep in pasture, to significantly reduce the losses to predators. There's also there's the reporting of losses is probably a factor as well. So other countries have various ways of verifying losses to predators. They will sort of genetically identify the predator from carcasses, or they will have specifically trained rural assessors or veterinarians who can definitively say what's killed that sheep or lamb. So this isn't the case in Norway. So full compensation is paid out greater than the slaughter value, and is paid out based on reported losses. So the sheep are counted out and counted back in, and then there tends to be an estimate of how many have been lost to predators and which predators. So this is absolutely not to suggest that people are playing a system or being dishonest. It's just that with that kind of sheep management, finding carcasses is a massive challenge. When you're working in huge remote areas which are inaccessible, forested, then it's very hard to determine what has been the fate of the sheep or the lamb that has been lost. And also, if there have been sheep that have been predated, then in the summer months, if you don't find them quickly, then they'll just decompose or be scavenged and scattered. There has been some success using these carcass detection dogs. So these have been quite effective at finding sheep carcasses, but they don't find them all, and obviously not everybody has a trained carcass detection dog. But generally speaking, it is believed that reported losses are overestimated based on an assumption of loss to predators and particular predators. So there was a team of independent scientists who were contracted by the government, and they looked at about 20 years worth of data from 78 radio tracked lynx, and they concluded that it was not actually possible for the lynx population in Norway to kill as many sheep as had been reported. And then an independent carcass survey conducted by the Norwegian Environmental Protection Agency found that about 10% of the cases reported could be reliably documented as killed by lynx. So sheep are killed by lynx in Norway. More sheep are killed by lynx than in any other country, but significantly less than would be reported, seems to be the general consensus. And so there's been a proposal to redesign the compensation system to be risk-based, so to be based on the presence of carnivores near your farm rather than in sort of a reactionary payout way. And I'll come on to this. This is quite similar to a scheme that Sweden have, which we'll touch on. But basically, in Norway, carnivores and predation play a part in changes to sheep farming in Norway, but they're not playing the whole part. So the losses are not evenly distributed either. So as we saw in the Jura, there's a few farmers who suffer large and repeated losses, and there'll be some farmers who have absolutely no problems with carnivores at all. So it's not evenly distributed. Within the carnivore management zones, it necessitates farmers to move to manage pasture and change their activities, which is burdensome and is not fully reimbursed. So, for example, you probably have to cut down the number of stock you have because you can't freely graze them. So you have to have as much stock as a particular bit of managed pasture can carry capacity-wise. You are also obligated to put up things like electric fences and to invest in other methods to try and reduce carnivore impacts. And again, these are costly, and there's an investment in time. And although these are compensated, they're not fully reimbursed at the moment. There's significant levels of stress associated with wolf and bear presence and predation, and some research has actually found that some farmers were basically suffering post-traumatic stress syndrome or disease symptoms from living with wolves and bears, and the fear of waking up to predated stock and what that might entail. But it doesn't seem to be so much of an issue for people living with wolverine and lynx. There will of course be some stress associated with living with these species, but I think the nature of their predation is so different in that they're very secretive. It happens very quietly. There don't tend to be these multiple killings that you get with bears and wolves, that people don't seem to be as stressed out living with lynx and wolverine as they do with wolf and bear. But the stress and anxiety of living with large carnivores is a very important consideration, which is often overlooked, especially when people are not used to having to live with these kind of species. So some farmers experiencing high levels of predation have given up farming in Norway. The total production across Norway has generally remained the same because there's been an increase in sheep farming outside of the carnivore management zones. So I suppose from a governmental perspective, they might regard this as a success because they're managing to balance carnivore conservation and sheep production. But for those sheep farmers for whom that traditional way of managing sheep on those unmanaged pastures, the impact on them would have been quite serious, and they would have had to either accommodate the large carnivores and change their practice, or they would have had to move their flocks outside of those management zones. But it is worth noting that sheep farming, and I say that because carnivores and predation play a part in changes in sheep farming in Norway, but not the whole part. So sheep farming was declining before the recovery of large carnivores. And this is part of a general pattern in Europe of rural to urban shift, where there's attractive opportunities in urban areas, an aging farm sector, rural depopulation, low demand for sheep products, and climate change also making it harder to farm sheep in the uplands and all these places. So all these countries, there's various mitigations used to try and put off large predators. Few are scientifically tested. There's a lot of ad hoc, stuff to try and stop carnivores predating livestock. There has been a very comprehensive review which looked at over a 40-year period. It picked out 114 studies which were very scientifically sound in the way they approached these investigations. And they basically found, and this included lynx, as one of their case studies was lynx in Sweden. And they basically found that there were 3 effective methods which they found generally had a positive impact in preventing livestock predation. One, and you'll forgive me for putting in a llama, and I hope no one thinks this is ridiculous, but they're actually quite effective at protecting flocks of sheep. So livestock guardian animals are by far and above the most effective deterrent for predators. This includes dogs, llamas, donkeys. So these species that have a defensive instinct and can be brought up with the flock are very effective at dissuading large carnivores. Protective enclosures would be the second best, and so this would generally be protective enclosures with electric fencing, such as this one, ideally with an overhang. So lynx have got an incredible jump, and a colleague of mine in Sweden they've trialed protective fencing with lynx in zoo situations, and there are some particular individuals which will just jump these fences. But if you put in an overhang, like you might do if you were protecting pheasants from pine martens, for example, then that's quite effective. And fladry, so these flapping flags on lines are actually very effective, particularly for wolves. I'm not sure how they would work with lynx, but they're particularly effective with wolves. So these 3 methods have been shown to be quite effective at reducing predation of livestock. Lethal control is used, but the results are unreliable. So in some places it works, in some places it doesn't, in some places it has the opposite effect and makes things worse. With lynx, as I discussed before, you tend not to have problem individuals, you have problem locations. So you might kill a lynx and then you'll just have another lynx coming back and doing the same thing. I imagine you'll experience the same thing with foxes. You might take out a vixen or a dog fox, and it won't be long before another fox comes in and fills in that vacant niche and causes the same kind of issues. So lynxes are strictly protected in Europe, so under the Habitats Directive, but Latvia, Sweden and Finland, they use derogations under Article 16 to allow a limited cull by hunters. So Switzerland have a 3-step approach to dealing with lynx livestock problems. So the government funds preventative measures. So they fund livestock guardian dogs or animals, and they fund flock protection fences. They also compensate losses of stock. So the government covers the losses of stock. And if there's persistent attacks, which in this case is more than 15 sheep, then they will lethally control that lynx. Lynx control hasn't actually been enacted in Switzerland since 2003. So although there is a sort of average loss in Switzerland of 75 sheep per year, they've not actually enacted lethal control since 2003. In Sweden, the compensation has devolved to county administrations, but they have a much more comprehensive compensation scheme. They account for the higher market value of organic livestock or ewes with lamb or in lamb, veterinary expenses, additional labour hours, and even lost environmental subsidies for when livestock involved in natural grazing schemes, for example. They include all of that into their compensation. They also fund electric fencing, not always 100% of it, and I think that farmers often have to pay up front for the fencing and be reimbursed for the cost of fencing, but they usually get a substantial proportion of that back. And then if they do have problem individuals, then again, they have the ability to give out a license on top, over and above the annual cull quota. So one thing that's interesting in Sweden, and this is particularly the case for reindeer in the northern part of Sweden, is that for the Sami herders, reindeer are, their bread and butter. That is their life. That is their livelihood is herding reindeer. So in the event in the north of Sweden, where the Sami are herding reindeer, then the Swedes proactively pay the reindeer herders to coexist with the predators. So if you have, for example, a brown bear, which is breeding within reach of your reindeer herd, then they will know from their research that over the course of that brown bear's lifetime, it might kill 10 sheep. So if that brown bear then has 3 cubs, then they will upfront make a proactive payment to those herders of a compensatory value for 30 sheep, which is what they would anticipate those cubs going on to kill in their lifetime. So they compensate loss, but they also make proactive payments based on the number of breeding events of the large carnivores. In Norway, lynx are treated as a quarry species, so they can be hunted. And each of those zones that I highlighted, each carnivore management board, they administrate a cull target with a national aim of limiting the population to 65 family groups. So depending on where the lynx are and how they're doing in different areas, then they kind of divvy up the number of lynx that can be culled that year, with the overall aim of keeping it to 65 family groups. Again, if you're in a carnivore management zone, then the onus is on you to make sufficient and adequate steps to avoid conflict with carnivores. So this includes fencing, shepherding, the use of guard dogs, and moving vulnerable livestock to less vulnerable areas. Now, these are funded, but it is generally thought that this funding is inadequate. It doesn't cover all of the costs at the moment in Norway. Additional permits are granted for problem animals. So, you can get permits to lethally control lynx above and beyond the cull target if you have problems. And then obviously farmers at the moment are compensated for the loss of sheep at a rate which is actually greater than the slaughter value. So the Norwegians can do this because they have this massive common good oil fund pot. So money is no objective to the Norwegian government when it comes to keeping the rural population happy. So I guess what we're investigating, what we're interested in speaking to you about, is could we live with lynx in Scotland? Is this something that could happen? Is it feasible? Is it desirable, or is it just absolutely not? Would the potential environmental benefits outweigh the potential costs? And would measures need to be in place to protect sheep farmers in the event that a lynx reintroduction was proposed? And could we be, based on what we've learned, for example, from the beaver reintroduction and the white-tailed eagle reintroduction, both of which have had significant stumbling blocks, can we learn from them, and can we be imaginative and proactive in facilitating coexistence with these, with something like the lynx, like the Swedes? Could living with lynx, for example, be part of an environmental payments approach to support farmers? This kind of thing. And so those are just some points I've put up just to maybe stimulate some thinking about questions or some discussion that we're going to have now. And just a reminder, engagement in this, engaging in this conversation. And it is a conversation. This is not this is not going to be used, for example, to facilitate lynx reintroduction. This is very much something we're exploring, in able to inform the debate better, to get some more light into it and a bit less heat, which is what has happened so far. But engaging in this does not mean endorsing it. It just means that you get your voices heard, which is the point of this webinar. So that's probably me for now. So I think we can move on. But thanks for listening. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, David. I found that really quite interesting. So I think just before we carry on, David has put a poll up on your screen just now. If everybody who is attending and participating would like to fill that in, that would be appreciated. So the next part of the evening is really opening up the floor for discussion, questions for David, etc. So we have a small panel who are representing the NSA Scotland committee. Tonight we have Alec Telfer, who is the president of the Blackface Sheep Breeders Association. He's an NSA Scotland committee member, and he is a farmer in the Borders. We have Sybil McPherson, who's a farmer from Argyll, and Mary, who also farms in the Borders as well. We've had one question so far come into the Q&A box, and I think I will ask it and throw Sybil in at the deep end to start with. The question is, when sea eagles were introduced, it was categorically stated that sea eagles would not predate on lambs. Denial of this happening went on for some years. Lynxes will predate on easy prey. What do the panel think? So I will throw that one to Sybil first, given the area that she farms in and her vast experience with the sea eagles.
Thanks for that, Jen. Yeah, and thank you, David. Very interesting to hear your presentation. And very interesting to hear what impacts are on various other countries. However, I feel Scotland's very different. And at this minute in time, the approach by Scottish Government with regards compensation and realisation of what has happened to both crofters and sheep farmers who have been severely impacted by sea eagle predation, and also the associated wildlife losses of many red listed species. There is no way in creation at this minute in time politically anyone would dream that a limited cull would ever happen. There's certainly not a government fund for compensation. I can't see that happening. We already have clear evidence of the loss of subsidies from people in Skye and Lochaber with sea eagle predation on their LFA subsidies, etc. And there's certainly no will, as I can see at the moment, despite repeatedly asking for help with that. So I think, although, yes, it's very interesting to hear what's happening in the other Scandinavian countries and Middle Europe, when we come to Scotland, and we're talking purely about compensation and management and eradication of problem animals, we are a million miles away, having experienced all of that for the last 10, 15 years personally, and for more than that, 30 years for the people in Mull. So I think we need to be very, very aware that Scotland is a very, very different place to parts of Europe. And there's several other things which I found a wee bit worrying. Orkney is not the highest density of sheep. We're talking about Shetland, which is a completely different island. So, just as a very ill-informed bystander looking at the presentation, several things cropped up to me which would not be applicable or accurate for Scotland. I think I've probably said enough for you to understand that I would be very, very wary of making any comparisons with other areas. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, Sybil. David, do you have any comments to add to that?
Yeah, I think you're right, Sybil. I don't think you can make comparisons between Scotland and Europe. It is very different here. We've had a sort of history of more intense land use and more land and a greater extent of land use change than Europe has. And I think that there would need to be. You can only infer so much based on the European example. I mean, Switzerland is probably what people generally think is the most similar scenario to Scotland. But I think there would need to be a hell of a lot of work put in to really dig into and quantify the potential impacts on sheep in Scotland. Anybody who suggests that there won't be sheep predation would be being extremely disingenuous. So there would be some level of sheep predation. And it's a case of exploring that and trying to work out to what extent that might be. And if it came to it and there was a strong desire for proportion of the public and from from environmental stakeholders to reintroduce lynx, at what point would that become would that be pushing the argument in favour of lynx reintroduction over the negative impacts on people who've actually got to live with these animals? I also agree that the situation with the white-tailed eagle has been unfortunate in that it's stable door and horse bolted and all that. I'm not sure what the solution to that is from my perspective at the moment, because it doesn't seem like there's a great deal of willpower on the part of government bodies to go into it in any great detail. Public opinion plays very strong roles in this kind of thing, and I think you're right that lethal control of sea eagles would not be acceptable at the moment. But again, these are things that ultimately we can learn from in trying to improve the science of reintroductions. But I think for the moment, what they highlight is that we've got a lot to learn before we could even seriously consider something like lynx reintroduction.
Yeah, just to come back with that, David, thanks for that. Yeah, I think we have a lot to learn, but we've gaily reintroduced various other things, i.e. larch and ash from Europe, to the detriment of our ash and larch forests. And I really think that we need to step right back and consider far more carefully, certainly than we did with sea eagle reintroduction, exit strategies and the protection of all our treasured species in Scotland, be they farmed livestock or our nature, red squirrels, Scottish wildcats would be something that I think would be greatly impacted by the reintroduction of lynx. And I think we need to be far more careful, and we need to definitely make sure that the powers that be would recognise the problems associated with reintroduced species in the way that you tell us that the Swedes and the Norwegians, etc., are, because at this minute in time, the outlook in Scotland is a million miles different.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sybil. I think one thing that I probably haven't gone to such lengths to highlight is that there are also opportunities and positives from reintroductions. So obviously there can be that we have treasured species. We have species like capercaillie and we have species like wildcat, but we also have entire habitats that we treasure, like Atlantic oakwood and like Caledonian pine forest, for example. So there would be a significant number of people who think that at the moment they are being threatened and undermined, not from reintroduced species, but from an imbalance in ecosystems. And so I think the whole rationale behind thinking about something like a reintroduction of a top predator is more about thinking about, okay, what role did predators like this play in ecosystems in terms of a regulatory role, in terms of their impacts on herbivores, impacts on other predators like foxes, for example, and in the long run, in terms of having a sustainable environment where we don't have to constantly worry about these treasured species, is something like a lynx reintroduction part of that process? At the moment, we're probably not, people aren't in a position to say whether that is or is not the case. But it's a kind of conversation which I think needs to be explored in detail, which is where we're coming in on this.
Yeah, I mean, having personally planted quite a lot of Scots pines, etc., to try and we're right on the edge of the remainder of the Caledonian pine forest. I mean, when we're talking about when lynx were about, people were running about trying to control deer with bows and arrows and things like that. All the woodland around here, with us anyway, is controlled by marksmen who shoot deer 365 days of the year, whether they're in calf or rearing calves, 24 hours a day. So controlling deer, which is now a sort of myth in Scotland, can actually be done very, very quickly, and perhaps not humanely, but it certainly that can be done in a completely different manner than when lynx helped us control them at least 500 years ago. We're in a completely different place than we were then. So I'm sorry, I can't agree that they're going to make a big difference if there is a deer problem, because we have the means to do it in a completely different manner nowadays.
Yeah, thanks, Sybil.
Yeah, Alec or Mary, do you have any points you want to add in just now before we get some more questions from our other attendees?
Well, I would like to add that up in maybe in the high hills, sheep predation may not be an issue in open areas, but when you come down into the lower ground areas where we've all been encouraged to create wildlife corridors through shelter belts and stuff like that, we've got the ideal habitat, hiding place for lynx, but we also have high concentrations of sheep. And I would really worry that they say that the lynx is an ambush creature, but it's ideal ambush country, and I think that say a lynx not fit to run and chase after deer. Well, it'd be dead easy pickings for them to go in and have sheep. Also, I'm wondering if what the RSPB are thinking about this, or have they been consulted? I mean, surely they must have an interest in the red listed ground nesting birds that are obviously going to be under threat, yet more threat from another carnivore parading around, raiding nests, etc. So that, I mean, really, I can't really comment on the sea eagle thing because I don't have first-hand experience, but I do know there are quite a lot of our members up the West Coast tearing their hair out because of a lack of an exit strategy. And it would be a real worry that if lynx were allowed to come back in, you know, they're going to be protected immediately, and you'll probably not get licensed to control troubled animals. And, you know, it's just, it would be a story repeating itself, and I don't think our members would welcome that sort of reintroduction.
Yeah, thanks, Alec. I think you're right. I think in Britain, where the habitat is probably is more fragmented and less extensive than it is in other parts of Europe where lynx have been reintroduced, then they may well use these intervening habitats more. So, you know, these areas of rough middle ground, what in Wales would call the Freeth, you know, which is this kind of sparse woodland with lots of gorse and broom and heather and that kind of thing. And I think that Joss Milner, I think in her report to the British Deer Society, said that was one thing which we would be a concern, is whether the lynx would utilise that kind of ground where they would be likely to come into contact with sheep. And I think that's a big question. And, you know, we can look at we can infer as something from Europe, but I think if we look at species like pine marten and goshawk, so in Europe they are ostensibly woodland animals, but we know that they behave quite differently in the UK because the habitat is very different. So pine martens are happier to go out into more open ground, as are goshawk. So we might expect the lynx to use that habitat more as well, in which case there would be a greater encounter rate with sheep, I imagine.
Okay, we've had a comment in the chat box just when we're mentioning deer anyway, so I'm going to read it out to everybody because it's just the panelists who can see it just now. So it's from Alison Gibbs, and she says, "We are sheep farmers and have been planting forest on part of our land. The planting has been heavily damaged by roe deer despite tubes and deer fence. The economic loss to our family from roe deer greatly exceeds the maximum losses that we could have expected from lynx, who control deer naturally and humanely." So that's just, you know, a comment that's slightly different to some that we've already heard that I thought was quite interesting just to throw in there. And if that, you know, anybody else has any comments along those lines to add.
Yeah, well, I'll just add that, yeah, again, that would be one of the strongest arguments put forward by proponents of lynx, is that they would provide a relatively free service, you know, in terms of deer control. What we don't know, and what will take a lot of extra effort and research, is whether there'll be any appreciative impact of lynx on deer. So Sybil mentioned that, you know, in some places we're well capable of controlling deer numbers through stalking and hunting, but there'll be other areas where they can't kill enough, and there'll be some areas where they can't access the deer. When they get into, you know, 7 to 20-year-old Sitka thickets, then you no matter how good your thermal imaging camera scope is, then you can't get at those animals, whereas that is the preferred habitat for lynx to hunt. So I think the idea is that they're not going to provide a silver bullet for deer control, but there needs to be some exploration about whether they could appreciably reduce the cost to the public purse. So again, you know, our role in this is not to advocate lynx. So any information that I put across, and all of the information in this talk, has all come from publicly available sources, mostly from scientific reports. We're interested in exploring what you think about this as a prospect. So although I can answer some of these questions as best as I can, you know, it's not my role to sort of sell the lynx to anybody. We very much sit on the fence on this. You know, I live and work in a farming community in Mid Wales. Some of my best friends are sheep farmers. You know, I'm well aware of the kind of issues associated with trying to make a living in the uplands at the moment, and what something like the lynx could mean for that.
Yeah, so that leaves, we have a question in the Q&A box from Derek Middleton, which says, "We have huge areas currently not used for livestock. Is there a place for the lynx in these areas, and should we focus on those?" So I would be interested to hear what maybe Mary thinks about that initially. If you want to come in, Mary. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Right. I'm not sure about, I haven't thought about that one, Jen, about introducing lynx to, you know, some areas that don't have sheep. I mean, I imagine that doesn't bother us, but just to go back to the situation 400 years ago when lynx were in Scotland, you know, we didn't have the population we have now. They didn't have the sheep numbers that we have now. You know, population requires to be fed, and David is actually stating that the lynx will predate sheep, and that for any sheep farmer is a horror. You know, it's, and whether it can be offset against you know, your payments, you know, is very debatable. I'm not being very forthcoming on this, but and, you know, that's basically where I see it. It's just not, it's not a starting point.
Can I come back on a couple of points there, Jim?
Yep, on you go.
So the first one, in answer to that specific question, was you could reintroduce lynx to areas where there's not much sheep farming, but you could never control their spread, where they would actually end up going. And it might be that some of the areas where there's quite high densities of sheep might also be some of the most productive areas where there's high densities of roe deer. And so the lynx are going to move to those areas where they'll basically go where their preferred food is, which is roe deer. And when there's not roe deer, it'll be things like brown hare and other deer species. So yeah, when you do reintroductions, you've got a certain amount of control in where you release animals, but you can never really control where they go. They just go where the most suitable habitat and food is. In relation to Mary's question, yeah, we've got more sheep than we ever would have done about 400 years ago, and there's also more of us. There's more people. All I would say is that the places like Switzerland and France, they probably have a greater population density than there is in the Highlands, in those areas that they have lynx. The other thing I'd probably note is that we also have more deer than we've ever had. Certainly more deer than we had 400 years ago in Scotland. So on the one hand, we have more sheep, but we've also got more of a lynx's preferred prey. And we've almost certainly got a considerable amount more forest than we would have done 400 years ago as well. So, you know, all of these things are changing at the same time. So although we have more sheep and we have a lot more people, we've also got a lot more food and a lot more cover. So again, these are kind of things which need to be explored, but it's a complex picture.
Yeah, thank you, David. We've had a comment here from Ian Miller that's just a comment. Any species will take the easiest meal available. Is this bringing the lynx into the category of unintended consequences? Which also leads on to a question from Andy Bell, who's asking, has the lynx in the Herz Mountains in Germany not virtually eradicated the wild sheep population and had little or no impact on deer numbers?
So the first question, yeah, you know, maybe I find at the moment hard to envisage a lynx reintroduction, so I find it hard also to predict whether there be unintended consequences. You know, there often are with reintroductions, but there's also surprise benefits that pop up as well. So again, it's a bit of a balancing act. In the Harz Mountains, I'm not intimately familiar with what the lynx do in the Harz Mountains. So as far as I'm aware, lynx are not considered a major problem for livestock in Germany. The issue in Germany and a lot of other European countries in Central and Eastern Europe tends to be with hunters and deer, in that lynx are often thought to compete with hunters for deer. So I'm afraid I don't know about the specifics in the Harz Mountains with sheep and deer, but I can find out and I can certainly get back to you on that, because a good colleague of ours has spent some time out there in the Harz Mountains working on lynx. So we can find out, but I'm afraid I don't have enough information to comment on that properly.
No, I think that would be good, David, if you could do some digging on for information on that. That would be really good. We have another question in the Q&A box from Day Tucker, who is asking, why are we starting at the top end predators to restore habitats? Why aren't we starting with soils, natural river restoration, wetlands, etc., wildlife corridors?
I think we're doing both. As far as I'm aware, I think with the sort of revamping of the agri-environment schemes, I think there'll be a lot of bottom-up focus. You know, there's a lot of peatland restoration stuff going on. There's a lot of new planting and a lot of focus on soil health. So I think, although obviously something like this conversation might grab a lot of the spotlight, and it might give the impression that there's a sort of disproportionate amount of effort towards lynx reintroduction, I think they're both happening at the same time, which I think is okay. I think it's fundamentally important to build from the bottom up, as you say, but I think it's also important to think about top-down dynamics as well, and to think how important they can be, and that they're worth exploring. Because in any ecosystem, it's never a simple case of saying it's all bottom up and it's all top down. You can never say that. It tends to be the two things happening together at the same time, which is why I think having this conversation about lynx. But absolutely agree. If soil health is not a priority, then it absolutely should be. But I think it probably is.
Okay, thanks, David. I think I'm conscious of the fact that we're bombarding you with questions. Is there anything that you would like to ask the panel that are here tonight as well?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm interested in is, for me, this comes down often to a central ethical question. So let's say, you guys, farmers, sheep farmers in particular, will be the people that, if there's a lynx reintroduction, will have to live alongside and be at the sharp end of it. You know, if there's going to be any negative impact, it's probably going to be with livestock, and then it will be you guys that have to actually bear the brunt of that. So one thing I often wrestle with is, and one of the reasons that we got involved in this is because I can see us on a trajectory where the desire for lynx reintroduction is going to increase. I think there's going to be a greater public appetite for it. There might even be an increasing political will for it. And I think over time, with the growth of things like rewilding and with the ideas about ecological regeneration, I think something like lynx reintroduction is going to keep on cropping up, and it's going to keep on getting a bit more airtime. So for me, I can imagine a situation where suddenly there's quite strong public opinion on this for lynx reintroduction, but it's going to be you guys on the ground which are potentially actually affected. So I suppose what I want to understand is compensating livestock adequately enough? Is supporting farmers economically and with technical support, is that enough? Or is it not acceptable emotionally and on your well-being that there might be predation of your sheep by lynx?
Alec, do you have an answer that you want?
Well, I don't, in reply to that, David, I really don't think that compensation is going to be enough. I mean, the thing is, we're a lot of the improved land in Scotland, we have quite a high concentration of livestock within the uplands. And, it's a farmer, he's looking after the welfare of his livestock, and he's taking huge pride in what he's producing. Now, if you could get a lynx to just run around and kill roe deer, that'd be absolutely ideal. But in reality, that just isn't going to happen. I think the people who would advocate the release of these animals should be made to provide quite a substantial bond and be personally responsible for it. Because why should the nation taxpayers have to compensate anyone? I mean, I don't see a real need to release these animals. We're a very different place to where we were 400 years ago. And I would actually maybe argue that earlier than that, there would be quite a high deer population. I mean, some of you look at what the Ettrick Forest was. It was a vast area of ground of woodland. And, and I mean, how would it be sold as some sort of tourism thing? Because these animals are nocturnal and shy. I mean, if you can't very well take people out in some safari to look at these wild animals, I mean, what you're going to come across is probably a pile of dead carcasses of attacked sheep. You know, because apparently some of them, you know, they don't just kill to eat, but they kill for the sheer pleasure, and it's just a cat's nature. I mean, I don't think compensation will be adequate enough.
Thanks, Alec.
Yeah, thanks, Alec. Just to, you know, we've had quite a lot of comments now off the back of that question. So Lorraine Lucier has come in and said, I think it's wrong to assume that sheep farmers would ever find compensation for losses acceptable, particularly if this were paid at commercial value. The loss of a young female breeding ewe is the loss of her breeding potential for 5 or more years and the loss of her progeny over that time. And I think that's a very good point, you know, and that's maybe where I would tend to align with my thoughts would be, you know, personally speaking here, would be that, you know, you spend all these years building up these bloodlines, and to see that, you know, taken away from you by somebody making a decision to release an animal, that would be very, very difficult for any of us, I think, to get our heads around, on top of what we already deal with in terms of predation. You know, Dee Tucker has come in as well, and she said that no amount of money could compensate for the emotional upset that she would feel. Andrew Barr has come in and said, all farmers by their very nature are born animal lovers, and any financial or other compensation would be negligible to the terrible stress of sheep deaths created by the introduction of any predators within the commercial farming. So I think that kind of gives you a fair impression of where we all stand on, you know, it's not a case of throwing money at us to make up for the fact of letting, you know, lynx roam around the countryside. It's the emotional, it's the dedication to the breeding, and the having to witness those animals being killed when, you know, we do our best every day to make sure they live as good a life as they possibly can. So that's it. That to me is one of the most important points that we have, really.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jem. Shall I pose another question? Or if just
Yes,
someone coming on
go
that?
for it.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering how you feel. Do you feel the same way about predation from native predators that are here already? Or is it
Mary, do you want to come in on that one?
Yes, I mean it's heartbreaking to, you know, to see a sheep lying there, a ewe lambing, for example, stuck lambing, the lamb's eyes and its tongues are pecked out by crows. I've had another sheep count and her stomach's all been eaten by badgers. She's still alive. You know, everything, all these predation casualties are heartbreaking. I mean, a sheep can die of a disease, pneumonia, something. You have semi-control over that, but the predators, you don't have the control. Badgers, you know, they have increased in numbers so much and protected. You can't do anything against it. You know, lynx would probably also be protected. So yes, I mean, any predator damage is heartbreaking.
So if it came to a situation where, for example, there was increasing political support for something like a lynx reintroduction, and it looked like something that was likely to occur, and I'm not saying that we'll arrive at that situation, but you know, I'm just imagining it might be prudent to think about that scenario should it occur. Then what kind of management would need to be in place to protect sheep farmers?
Sybil, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we have to look extremely closely at what's happened with the reintroduction of sea eagles. I mean, no one envisaged how successful they would be. There was no exit strategy at all thought of. They're called sea eagles, but certainly with several of the pairs that are around here, they will certainly never ever go near the sea. They've found an alternative food source, be it lambs or black grouse or red-throated divers. And I think it's such a huge issue if we suddenly release something. And as I say, there's so much to be learned from the difficulties that have been experienced by the reintroduction of sea eagles. I would put the brakes on absolutely everything else until we can try and get some sort of sensible idea of exactly the impact, not only to farmers' livelihoods in the day, and Lorraine were absolutely right, and Mary, to say that, you know, our whole life is devoted to trying to raise them, give them the best life possible, and to see them being suffering in lots of cases, as Mary said, and we have sheep too, they're chased and attacked by sea eagles. I think we need to be far more sure before we even begin to consider what the implications would be with the reintroduction. And I would imagine that lynx would be as heavily protected as sea eagles will be. And I think, you know, to even be considering it at this minute in time until we've sorted out what sea eagles and beavers, of course, too, another reintroduced species, which is having a huge impact on agriculture and the environment. I think we need to step back and be very, very careful how we go forward with this. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, Sybil. There's another 2 or 3 comments that appear, and I'm trying to keep up with them all at the moment. Lorna Patterson has said, you know, she would ask that David, it's maybe not slightly in your remit as you're reporting back to the 2 organisations that have commissioned this study, but, you know, report back to the government and probably to them as well that for farmers and shepherds and crofters, sheep and lamb deaths are not only financially destructive regarding predator damage, they are equally affected by emotional losses. It's horrific for farmers and other sheep and lambs in the flock upon finding the predated animals in the aftermath. You know, we can't overstate just how much of an impact it would have on people. And at the end of the day, you know, there are people on both sides of this debate, and you know, it was a webinar that I wondered whether we should be hosting as a farming membership organisation, because I felt that some people would maybe feel we shouldn't be venturing into the conversations of you know, about lynx and a reintroduction, but I felt it's, you know, there's people on both sides of this argument, and we have to realise that that we're not just farmers, we're people, and we have thoughts and feelings as well as the people who want to reintroduce the lynx as well. And that's, you know, we can't have any sort of constructive conversation until we accept that, I think. So that was part of the reason for wanting to potentially host this webinar. I don't know, there is a few other comments here. I would just like to say we are kind of running out of time a little bit at the moment, but if there are questions aren't answered, then we will go through them and David will get back to you and we can pass that information on. So there's one here from Ian Miller. We have QMS farm assurance with the high standards of welfare and animal care. So why expect farmers to accept our sheep suffering slow deaths at the claws of a new predator? So I suppose that's along the same idea, but I think it makes an interesting point that, you know, we're bound by these farm assurance schemes to look after our animals, but then, you know, just willy-nilly the predators can come along and, you know, cause suffering to the animals.
It's a really good point. So this is one, this wasn't on my radar until my mate Davith back in Wales highlighted the very same point. He was highlighting that obviously, you know, we've got some of the strongest animal welfare legislation in Europe, and our standards of animal welfare are generally high, very, very high. And, you know, a farmer's prestige is based around the quality and health of his stock. And so, yeah, he said the same thing. You know, how can we be put or be potentially face such punitive measures if we don't look after our livestock, but it's okay to release a top predator which can potentially damage livestock and kill livestock, which is out of our control. So that's a really, really good point. The only thing I would add to that as a clarification, and this is from me as a zoologist now, is that lynx do not slowly kill their prey. They do not, it's not a torturous affair, and they don't play with their prey. Lynx are incredibly efficient killers, and it's over very quickly. It's over with a throttle to the neck. It's not a case of cat and mouse. It's about, you know, it needs to be dispatched before it could potentially damage the lynx. So I'll just add that from a purely zoological point of view, but the point is a very, very good one, and it's not appreciated more widely.
Yeah, no, I think it is a very, very good point, and thank you to Ian for raising that. We have another question. Oh gosh, just shot up my screen. It's from an anonymous attendee, and they're asking, does David know what the worst individual farm losses are? You know, so like numbers killed is the question.
Not off the top of my head, no. I'd have to. I could probably find out. The data's probably in those studies I use, so I could dig that out. I don't know off the top of my head.
Could I come in there, Jen, on that one?
Yep, on you go, Sybil.
In the experience of predation of sea eagles, a lot of it depends on alternative prey species. And I think in vast areas of Scotland, we actually don't have, this might be very different in the woodlands, but in vast areas of Scotland, we don't have enough to sustain them. Certainly when it comes to springtime of year, and I presume these lynx will be breeding and they've got kits to feed, you know, they might not kill the yow, but they've killed the lamb. So the suffering is for the yow with potential mastitis, all those types of things. So it's not only the actual animal they've killed, it's parent or its child, etc. And it's definitely, you know, geared to alternative prey. And I think we're in a very different place in Scotland now with what's available out with the farmed livestock.
It's a good point, Sybil, for the white-tailed eagle, I think. For the lynx, I think one thing that actually most people really do agree on is that there's a plentiful supply of wild food for lynx in Britain, in Scotland. So I think that's the one area, you know, there's a lot of contention over different aspects of whether lynx would do all right here, whether there'd be conflicts, whether they'd persist. But I think one thing that almost everyone does agree on is that there'd be plenty of food for them to eat here, wild food, based on the abundance of deer, but also things like brown hare, mountain hare, rabbits, and the other food that makes up their diet.
And there is also an abundance of fish in some of the sea lochs in Scotland, but it doesn't mean that the white-tailed eagles that are here are fishing in these sea lochs. So I think we need to be, you know, it's a huge thing. And I think, Jen, you know, you mentioned a wee while ago about talking about it. I think the only way to get through these things is to have people talking about it. Dialogue's really important. And I think we have to remember, and I think Peter Miles brought up a point there about the mouflon now being the rarest sheep in Europe. You know, I think there's so much to be discussed, and I think we really need to take a step back and be very cautious. And I'm sure David's, you know, well aware of that. I see he's nodding. But
yeah.
I just
knew. I mean, I would consider this. I would consider what we're doing the step back. So, you know, what's happened before is people have popped up and said, we propose a Lynx reintroduction. We have picked this area, and now we're going to do some token consultation, which involves, you know, a talk or something like that. This is the step back. This is where we are standing back and trying to find out, right, is this acceptable in any way? You know, what do people think of the issues? Where are the knowledge gaps? You know, what can we learn from what's gone on before? So this is the step back, I think, in terms of the kind of exploration we're doing to present back to this partnership. And I have enormous admiration for you guys for putting this on. I know it's a conflicting topic. It's a fiery topic. It has previously been a fiery topic. And I'm glad that you've trusted us to be able to come in and have this conversation with you. I'm enormously appreciative of that, because it is a conversation. It's not, as I said, this is not attached to a proposal, and there's no proposal forthcoming in the near future. Almost nobody thinks that it's possible that there could be a reintroduction, for example, within 10 years' time. So it's about just exploring this, because it's a conversation which will not go away. It's going to keep on coming. So we felt that we're in a position to get this off to a good start, and to make sure that the voices of farmers, for example, sheep farmers, are properly represented. And so that point earlier about making sure that the impacts on people's well-being, the emotional toll, is represented, absolutely. You know, that's something which is very important to me, coming from or living in an upland sheep farming community in mid Wales, and having, you know, experienced people who have, you know, gone and lost 9 ewes and a lamb to a couple of lurchers, that kind of thing. You know, I know how hard that is, and so that will absolutely make it into the kind of feedback that we make to the people we're reporting to.
Yeah, thank you, David. Just another couple of comments that have come into the chat box, because the other attendees can't actually see them. So we have Dave Tucker who's saying wholesale change of hill sheep management would be required to protect flocks. Present management is what is creating the tough resilient genetics that flow down the hill. We lose those genetics at our peril. I think again that is a very good point from Day. And also Lorraine highlights as well, we should make it clear that the kind of mitigation measures adopted by Norwegian farmers such as carcass detection dogs or moving sheep to another area would be impractical and unacceptable in Scotland. So I think that's just to put those two comments out there. But yeah, as I say, we're basically at our time limit for tonight. So anybody who does have questions or comments, we will follow those up. But I would just like to say thank you firstly to David and to Jenny for coming on tonight. And to David for approaching us initially in the first instance and getting in contact with us. It doesn't often happen that way, so that was a refreshing change. And also to Mary and Sybil and Alec for taking the time to come on tonight. That's been much appreciated as well. And obviously to all of you too. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you very much.